Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I'm Dan Porterfield, the President and CEO of the Aspen Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our third Sandra Day O'Connor Conversation. We're so pleased and honored to be joined today by another proud Arizonan, the former U.S. Senator Jeff Flake, who will be in conversation with our own Merle Chertoff, Executive Director of the Institute's Justice and Society Program. And Merle conceived of this series and is celebrating her 10th year at the Aspen Institute. Please join me in welcoming Sandra Flake and Cheryl Flake, his wife, who's joining us here. Thank you. I promise you, Sandra, a highly engaged, highly informed audience. It's great to see a full house for this opportunity. And I'd like to express our thanks to our sponsors, the law firms of Shook, Hardy & Bacon, Foley Lardner, Garfield Hecht, Gibson Dunn Crutcher, Ambassador Boyden Gray, for their support of this series, as well as our trustee, Jerry Hosier, and his wife, Annie. And Justice O'Connor, a lifetime trustee of the Aspen Institute, was, as we all know, a giant on the Supreme Court. Her practical approach to jurisprudence never strayed from a focus on the lives of actual people. Senator Flake, in his recent book, The Conscience of a Conservative, articulates a similar view of governing that puts people and families at the center. This emphasis is very much aligned with the vision and values of the Aspen Institute and our work to promote a free, just, and equitable society in partnership with communities and grassroots organizations, local people working around the country and around the world. We wish that Justice O'Connor could be here with us tonight. She can't be, but we celebrate her legacy and her impact in her absence. Now, Senator Flake is very much the kind of values-driven leader that we cultivate and celebrate at the Aspen Institute. After attending Brigham Young University, Senator Flake worked for a public relations firm in Washington, D.C., before serving as the executive director of the Foundation for Democracy in Namibia. After serving 6 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, he earned election to the Senate in 2012, and I know we'll learn a great deal today from what he has to say. Again, thank you for being here, and please join me in welcoming Senator Jeff Flake and Merle Chertoff.
Dan, thank you so much for that gracious introduction. And Senator, thank you so very much for being here with us and taking time away from your new CBS series, Common Ground. You've done a couple of these, and I understand there's more coming up, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And we also want to thank Cheryl for being here with you. In 2017, you wrote a book, The Conscience of a Conservative, which was a shot across the bow to the Trump administration. And my favorite line out of that is, if a principle is only defended when there's nothing at stake, it's not much of a principle at all. So we're going to talk about what it is to be a principled conservative. But before that, let's do a little Arizona hometowning. So like Justice O'Connor, you grew up on a ranch in Arizona. And you talk about that in your book, about the F-Bar Ranch. So what did you learn growing up on the F-Bar?
To be early to dinner. I had 10 brothers and sisters. I had 69 first cousins on my father's side alone. That's how I got elected, actually. But I did grow up in Snowflake, Arizona. It might seem like a strange name for Arizona, but it's up in northern Arizona. My great-great-grandfather, William Jordan Flake, was sent by Brigham Young back in 1878 to colonize Arizona. And so he went from Utah to Arizona, tromped around for 6 months, went back and said, there's nothing worth colonizing down there. So the legend has it, Brigham Young said, sell all you have and go and look a little harder. And so he did. He bought this valley where Snowflake now is, was traveling back to Utah to get his cattle to pay for it. And he ran into Erastus Snow, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who was a Mormon apostle. And Erastus Snow said, I heard you started a settlement what have you called it? He said, I haven't named it. He said, call it Snowflake for the two of us. And so that's how it got its name, and that's where I grew up. My father, Dean Flake, was the mayor of Snowflake for a while. There are about 5,000 people there now, and mostly Flakes. A good number of them. My uncle Jake Flake from Snowflake was Speaker of the House for a while. So Arizona is about the only place you can be elected with the name of Flake. So, but anyway, that is where I grew up, and it was a great childhood. I mean, obviously, you grow up on a ranch, you learn to work, and I learned that I didn't want to milk cows my whole life, and politics was a pretty good option. So that's where I went.
And you told some stories about ranch life and about the people who worked on the ranch and your early relationship with people who were not American citizens.
Right. Yeah, I talked in the book, and I've written extensively about, I've been involved with immigration reform. When I got to the Senate, the first thing I did was, Senator McCain came and said, hey, let's do immigration reform. It'll be fun. He lied, but he convinced me to join the Gang of Eight, and we embarked in what I still think was a wonderful effort, and I think it will bear fruit in the end, a way to, have more secure borders, but also humanely deal with those who are here illegally now, create new guest worker programs, and deal with high-tech immigration as well. I thought it was, and I still believe it will be the basis of what needs to be done in the future. But I really got my background there by working on the farm with migrant labor. We had migrant labor, mostly from Mexico. At that time, it wasn't illegal to hire them. It only became illegal later after I left, but it was illegal for them to be there. But I worked alongside of them, and I talked a lot about Manuel, who stayed on a ranch for 24 years and ultimately got a green card and raised a family of 6 in Arizona who have all contributed greatly to society. And I've always felt that the motivation that brought those, and I know people come with different motivations, and there are cartels and people who come that we need to be very concerned about, but the overwhelming majority of those who come across the border are seeking a better life. And we need to find a way to deal with that, and in ways that honors their plight and also serves our country and our economy. And I think we can do that. But I've never been able to look at that population and see a criminal class. And that comes from working on the ranch.
Now, before we leave Arizona, I want to ask you about one more thing. So both in your book and in O'Connor's memoir about the lazy bee, you both talk about a particular test of new romantic interests. And Justice O'Connor wrote that John O'Connor passed the test, and it involved a barbecue of particular parts of cows. You want to tell us a little bit about that? Is this like an Arizona ranch thing?
Very much so. When I read Life on the Lazy Bee, Sandra Day O'Connor's book about being raised on a ranch in southern Arizona, I just couldn't help but think that just about every story she had, there's a corollary in northern Arizona on the F-Bar where I was raised. And that's why I've always had such a kinship and a friendship and admiration for Sandra Day O'Connor. And I was able to have an interview with her where she interviewed me a few years ago for the Institute, and it was so wonderful to reminisce. And on that story about when people come to date your kids, or in my case, my wife Cheryl came to Snowflake, and my dad, of course, and still to this day, my sister-in-laws cringe when my dad was saying, how many grandkids he has. He talks about how many daughters-in-law he has that are in production, which is an old ranching term that goes well in Snowflake, not so much elsewhere. but my dad grabbed Cheryl and took her out where we were branding calves, but also fertility testing bulls. And if anybody's ever seen that process or participated in it, it's not something you want to take your first date to. But having survived that, she knew what she was in for. But it is a great way to grow up, and I think it instills, certainly characteristics and virtues that can serve you well later on. It certainly did for Sandra Day O'Connor.
And a number of distinguished Arizonans, Chief Justice Rehnquist, O'Connor, McCain, you, people who have stiff spines and are able to stand up for what they believe in. And speaking of what you believe in, let's talk about conservatism a little bit. You ran the Goldwater Institute, and I think Goldwater was a hero of yours. For some in our audience, he may not have been quite as popular as he is with you. What did you learn from Barry Goldwater that shaped your own politics?
Well, I liked him so much. The book I wrote, I stole his title, The Conscience of a Conservative, really as homage to him. One thing I appreciate about Barry Goldwater, which I think should apply in this day, if you remember back in the late 50s, early 60s, there was a big concern among Republicans that the John Birch Society was kind of taking the party in a different direction than the party wanted to go. And so Barry Goldwater at that time and William F. Buckley, who provided a lot of the intellectual heft for the movement, decided that they really needed to, as I think Buckley and Goldwater put it, we cannot have this emblem of irresponsibility in the party. And so they made a concerted effort over a couple of years to basically marginalize that conspiratorial element, that emblem of irresponsibility, because they didn't want the Republican brand tarnished by it. And I think about that to this day, and I think the Republican Party would have done well a few years ago to try to eschew the emblem of irresponsibility from taking over the party. But Barry Goldwater, the rugged individualist, there were a few things that I disagreed with him on, his position on the Civil Rights Act, even though his explanation was certainly something you could understand. I think I would have done differently, but I admired the man greatly, and he was all Arizonan, and I was pleased to run the Goldwater Institute, and one of my favorite memories was a dinner we had there with Barry Goldwater giving away the Goldwater Award to Margaret Thatcher, with William F. Buckley there as Master of Ceremonies. And so I got to stand in a picture there with some of my conservative heroes, and it was a wonderful time.
So this week we've got our Justice and Society program seminar here, and we're reading a number of authors, and one of the people who we read is Frederick Hayek, who is a hero of the conservative movement and who spoke about free markets, free minds, and free men, but also wrote an essay called Why I Am Not a Conservative, and he gives two reasons. The reluctance to accept well-substantiated knowledge, which in Hayek's day was evolution, and the susceptibility of conservatism to the corrupting influence of nationalism. So what are the parallels today?
Well, certainly
might be a couple.
Extreme nationalism, I think that applies certainly to today, and we would do well to heed his advice, and that is one danger if he sees that as conservatism. I would quibble maybe labeling it as such, but extreme nationalism is a problem. And it's a problem with our party today. You can call it something different, but I think Hayek had it right, at least that label. And failure to accept knowledge, I would certainly believe that the Republican Party as a whole, our failure to acknowledge the reality of climate change and to make any serious effort to deal with that.
Let's drill down on that a little bit. What, if you were the czar of the world, what would you be doing on climate change?
Well, as a conservative and one who believes in the free market, we always preach that if you want less of something, you tax it. If you want less carbon, you ought to tax it. And so in the House of Representatives, about 10 years ago, I introduced a bipartisan revenue-neutral carbon tax bill. And I introduced, along with Chris Coons, a bipartisan carbon tax, revenue-neutral carbon tax bill in the Senate. So I think that's the only way at scale you can really get to this problem. And for us, it's easy to put off, I think. For Republicans, I think politically that's dangerous. Forget the substance of it. Politically, I think millennials are, have been walking away from the party for a while. I think they're in a dead sprint right now. And we've got to do better in that regard. I just came back a week ago from a week in the Marshall Islands in the middle of the Pacific. 1,500 islands in that chain, not one part of which is any more than 6 or 8 feet above sea level. And to them, climate change is a reality. Just a king tide will wash over the islands there. And so it is something that I think we need to work with our international partners on. And I think that we've got to do it at a scale that matters. And I think the only way to get to that is to do it with a carbon tax.
I want to go back to the other piece, that corrupting influence of nationalism. So every 4 years, the country gets to be 2% less white. Why isn't the Republican Party trying to broaden the base?
We conducted an autopsy on the election of 2012, and that was the conclusion we came to, was that the Republican Party needed to appeal to a broader electorate. When you look at every election, 2% less white every 4 years. And given the other issues that we're dealing with, I think I mentioned millennials, suburban women, so-called soccer moms, are also running from the party. I think you saw that in the midterms, and I think you'll see it certainly coming up. But we've got to appeal to a broader electorate. And I think conservatism, belief in free markets, limited government, economic opportunity, conservatism should appeal to immigrants. It has in the past, but when you have language that is so offensive to immigrants and minorities, that I think it's a gateway issue. You just don't get in the door to even talk to people if you use language that turns them off. And so we can't even start to explain what policies we would prescribe if we can't even talk to them. And so I do think that that's a problem.
So I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole to spend too much time on this name, but is Donald Trump a conservative?
Well, one definition of a conservative is one who adheres to norms and traditions. And so not so much there. Another is a belief in limited government, economic freedom, and individual liberty. And I would question the president's adherence on each of those fronts. Certainly on limited government, we're running trillion-dollar deficits in times of plenty. There are times, during times of war or coming out of a big recession, where there might be some excuse, but boy, there's no excuse for that today. So that has been an animating principle for conservatism, even if we haven't agreed on other things, the belief in limited government, and that's in real question right now. And then, the value of American leadership around the globe, that's been a bedrock principle of conservatism. And I can tell you, traveling a lot over the last couple of years, that is in real jeopardy as well.
Well, what are you hearing from your colleagues who are still in the Senate, from your fellow Republicans?
Obviously, they may tell me something different than you see. There is concern. I think that we haven't fully owned up publicly politically to what happened in the midterms. If not for a very favorable Senate map, we would have lost the Senate. But losing 40 seats in the House, that's a shellacking that we really haven't owned up to. And I think those same trends are coming. And most of my colleagues, I think, recognize it. But but this is, much to my consternation and many of us, this is the president's party right now. And if he wants the nomination, he'll get it. And I think that spells danger for the future of conservatism, because I don't think that this brand, if you can call it even that, of conservatism can endure. There's just not much there. But also, it's just tough to win elections when you're turning off individual groups with abandon. And so I know that some of my colleagues share this, but I can tell you, though, if you want to win a primary in most states right now, to even question the president's policies or behavior is troubling enough, but to be opposed to some of the policies or the behavior, that's a non-starter, and my colleagues recognize that as well. For me, personally, I could not support the president in the last election. His embrace of birtherism, to start with, was just abhorrent to me, and then the way he talked about my colleague John McCain, and then minorities and others, I just couldn't support him, and I would have liked to have served a second term. It takes a lot to get to the Senate. I was in the House for 12 years, but in the end, I could not see myself standing on a campaign stage with the president and to be okay when people shouted, "Lock her up," or while he demonized friends of mine on the other side of the aisle and spoke ill of them. And for me, I couldn't do it. That's where I was.
And the president, you said, is the end point of a continuum, and but he's a symptom of something which is a broader trend. When do you think that the politics of personal destruction began?
This trend that we've been on, the president is not the author of a lot of the dysfunction in Washington. This has been a trend we've been going on for a while, and this failure to get along and this extreme partisanship has been a long time in building. We were talking a little before about the origins of it. Mo Udall, another famous Arizonan, wrote a book in the 1960s called The Job of a Congressman. And I read it a while ago and was struck he said, "We have enough money in our office budget to travel home 3 times a year." So this is somebody who, when you were elected at that time, you moved your family to Washington. And your kids went to school with the other senator or congressman's or congresswoman's kids. They played sports together. There was a level of trust developed and friendship developed that was strong enough to endure through the weekdays, that trust that was built on the weekends. And that, as air travel got cheaper and more frequent, that started to go away. But in the 1990s is when it really accelerated. Newt Gingrich, when he was elected with, I think, 75 new Republicans, he instructed them, don't bring your family to Washington. Stay in your home districts. You're going to need to run for re-election. And so a trend that was already happening was really accelerated. And by the time I got to Washington in 2001, we really had a commuter Congress, which we have even more so today, where you get to Washington on a Monday afternoon or Monday evening or a Tuesday, and you leave without fail on a Thursday night. And you just don't get to know your colleagues well. You don't. There's an old saying in Washington that you'll never question your colleagues' motives if you know the names of his or her children. And too few of my colleagues today know the names of their colleagues' children, and that it's very difficult. And then you add on social media and what that's done, the culture of media today, and it just drives people apart. And then if you have a president in the White House that plays on those divisions, then you have a perfect storm for total Washington dysfunction. And so we won't reverse the trend in terms of a commuter Congress. It's never going to get back to the way it was. So you need strong leaders who will put partisanship aside and actually have some trust and some friendship with their colleagues, and that's missing too much today. When I got to the Senate, I was so kind of disgusted with it that I took my colleague Martin Heinrich, a Democrat from New Mexico, was elected the same time I was, and we said, let's maroon ourselves on a Pacific island for a week and see if we can survive together. I'm being serious, we did that. Discovery Channel came along and filmed the experience for a week. They called it Rival Survival. Although we got along pretty well. We survived a week with no food, no water, just a machete between us on an island. We came back and did kind of the circuit on the talk shows and went on David Letterman. And Stephen Colbert ran a clip of us, spearing a fish or trying to eat a raw clam, and he said, Flake and Heinrich proved once and for all Republicans and Democrats can get along if death is the only option. So for what it's worth, we've proved that empirically. But it is, the incentives are all wrong. There is no currency politically for reaching across the aisle. And so when it happens, it's because a member of Congress feels strongly, I've got to do this, because the incentives are not there to do it. It still happens on occasion. You mentioned Common Ground. I just got back yesterday from Washington interviewing Cory Booker and Mike Lee to talk about criminal justice reform. That's one bright star.
That's another odd couple.
A very odd couple.
Yeah.
But they got together, and a number of others on this issue, and we pushed it through. The White House played a constructive role there. That it can happen. It's extremely infrequent, but it can happen. And so that will air next week on CBS, by the way. So.
Wonderful. Who are some of the other Democrats you've worked with and admire?
Tim Kaine. Tim, I've worked very closely with, particularly on trying to put some guardrails or parameters on presidential power when it comes to declaring war or engaging in hostilities. We're still working under the 2001 AUMF authorization of use of military force in Afghanistan. It just doesn't fit very well for the conflicts that we're engaged with today. And so Tim and I worked for 6 years to try to get an authorization for use of military force, and just could not. Still have not been able to get that across the finish line. And Tim, just to give you a sense of how difficult it is to reach across the aisle, Tim Kaine, when he was selected by Hillary Clinton as his running mate, or her running mate, I tweeted out just playfully, now I have to count the ways I hate Tim Kaine. I said, but he's a good friend and a good man, congratulations. And immediately I was inundated with texts and emails and phone calls. And I was at a Republican event a day later in Arizona where somebody actually stood up and said, why are you doing that? Why are you consorting with the enemy?
Yikes.
And said, don't you know, if you can't say anything bad, don't. And he stopped right there. He stopped before he reversed.
That's not what my mama told me.
Exactly. He reversed all that advice he'd gotten. But that's how difficult it is. And it reminded me of when Gabby Giffords was shot. She was a friend of mine, and she was right before the State of the Union address. And we, the Arizona delegation, left an empty seat in her honor and sat together, Republicans and Democrats, that year. It was 2011, I believe. The next year, or 2010, the next year she had recovered enough to come to Washington, but only to resign the next day. But she came for the State of the Union address, and so I sat with her. And she wanted to stand when President Obama would deliver the applause lines, as any good Democrat would, but she couldn't stand on her own, so I would help her up, which left me, a lone Republican, standing among a sea of Democrats. I immediately started to get texts and emails and calls that went long into the night. Why are you doing that? Do you agree with President Obama? It's just, that's where we are right now. That's where we are, and it's difficult, so it takes a lot a lot more for members of Congress to reach across the aisle.
Now, you were one of the people who served on the subcommittee on privacy and technology, and you're describing online bullying that you suffered. What are we going to do about social media and the effects of these platforms and the lack of transparency?
You know, that's something that is going to be an issue long into the future. Every time we think that we've struck some kind of balance there, technology changes, and there are new platforms and new things that we have to deal with. It's like the struggle between, you know, freedom and security in terms of technology. It will go on, but it is a problem. It's bullying, whether it's what kids have to endure or what politicians endure and others. It just drives people to the extremes, and we haven't done a very good job. I'm not sure exactly what form that will take in the end, but I think mostly we've got to lead by example as elected officials in our use of social media, and do it in ways that will better the debate rather than further polarize people. And I'm worried about where we're going there. I've been quite critical of the president over the past couple of years in his use of social media in ways to, like I said, demean opponents, call my colleagues losers and clowns, and I've called him out on many occasions. And so about 6 months ago, a newly elected Democrat from, I believe, Michigan, tweeted out something like, we've got to, or she was in a campaign speech, she said, on live television, we've got to, in very vulgar terms, impeach this man. And I thought, that's not right. So I tweeted out, we shouldn't use language like this. The fact that the president does should not give the rest of us license to do so. Immediately, there's something called being ratioed in social media, where the number of comments on a tweet exceed the number of likes or retweets. Immediately, within a day or so, there were more than 30,000 comments on that tweet. And they were all over the place, but the vast majority of them said, if the president speaks this way, then so must we. And that's what concerns me most about this era that we're in. It's not enough, in my view, to move beyond Trump, but we've got to move beyond Trumpism. And Trumpism hasn't just infected the Republican Party. It's broader than that. And some of us don't want to admit that, but it has. And so we've got to, all of us as elected officials, do better by example on social media.
And what about in the hometowns? I mean, you come from a small town in Arizona. Where does this start? How do we start building up the civil discourse and getting people to talk to one another again and not villainize each other?
You see it in small towns because when you're elected as mayor on the city council or school board or an irrigation district or whatever else at the local level, you retire and move on, but you're still there. You're there with your neighbors, with other families that you've dealt with, and that puts a brake, I think, on how you act as an elected official or somebody responsible. And at the local level, you actually have to balance budgets. You can't kick the can down the road past a CR and say, well, let somebody else deal with it. So there are a lot of things institutionally that favor actually getting along at the local level, but I think most of it is that you live with these people afterwards. You want your reputation to hold. I think it's too easy to go to Washington and develop a new persona and new fans and people who like you on social media or on the cable shows, and that's enough. But that's more difficult to do at the local level. So I think that, I always like to see people come up who've served on a school board, served on a city council or mayor, or exercised executive authority in some way to come to Congress. I didn't come up that way, but I watched a lot of it, family members and others who served in office. And those who have served locally, I think, have a better sense and sometimes find it easier to act in ways that they'll be proud of later.
Well, and that's one of the things we love about Justice O'Connor was her service in the Arizona legislature and her being very active in community affairs in Phoenix. And so that gave her a common touch, which informed her her work on the court.
You bet.
So we've got about 10 minutes before we go to audience questions. So I want to move into some things which maybe a little more controversial. Let's ask about your role in the confirmation hearings for now Justice Brett Kavanaugh. You delayed the vote for a week. You asked for an investigation by the FBI. Are you satisfied with what came out of it and with the role that you played in those confirmation hearings?
I would have liked to have started the FBI investigation sooner and had it been more thorough. But I will say that it was more substantial than those who haven't read it know. And I do believe that the country would feel better about where the Senate landed in this regard had they been able to read that report. When I got to that committee meeting, the markup where we passed Kavanaugh to the full Senate, I knew that even if I voted no, they could still move the nomination forward. That would not block it, but I thought that I could get a commitment to do the investigation. I thought that we had not done due diligence in the Senate. And when I got to that committee room and saw the food fight that was going on between Republicans and Democrats, I just thought, we aren't there. The country's not there. The Senate as a body isn't there. So I would have liked to have done it all differently. I would like to move back to a time where Sandra Day O'Connor was approved 99-0. We're not likely to get back to that time, but where we all feel better about where we are with these nominees. And a lot of this has to do with still lingering resentment, well justified, I believe, with the way Merrick Garland was handled.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. I was going to be my next question. How do you, in retrospect, feel about your role in delaying that confirmation hearing and going with your caucus on that?
No, I do. I wish that I had, and all of us would have insisted that he be given a hearing and move forward. By September, I was feeling badly about where we were. I met with him. He was a good man, far more conservative than my colleagues would admit. He was more of a centrist
Former prosecutor.
You bet. And I had hoped and actually started working with President Obama at that time that if we got to a lame duck, everybody assumed at that time it would be Hillary Clinton in the White House or coming to the White House, so in a lame duck session, and I could maybe convince my Republican colleagues to move the nomination, because on the theory that she would be more conservative than somebody that Hillary Clinton might pick. And I believe I had some of my colleagues ready to move. I had a letter drafted to Chuck Grassley, the chairman of the committee, and to Mitch McConnell, that I was going to hit send on at midnight, election night, saying, now let's move Merrick Garland. But the election didn't go as we thought it would. So, but I do think that what Mitch McConnell did in saying we're not going to consider this nomination was not unprecedented. You'd have to go back to 1888 to find a time, and people can parse this in different ways, but it's still, in my view now, in retrospect, was not right. And I think if we just lurch back and forth on this nomination process to, more extreme candidates nominated every time. That's not a good place to be in. So I would have gladly at any time had Merrick Garland's nomination come to committee. I was prepared to vote for it, and would do it if I were in the Senate today, if he was brought up today. And I do think that I would like to move back to a time prior to 2003 when no senator would ever filibuster the president's executive calendar. You give everybody an up or down vote. As controversial as Clarence Thomas was, or Judge Bork, they still got a vote. And nobody blocked their nomination going through. And I wish we could move back to that time. I doubt we're going to get there.
What do you miss most about Congress?
The people. I was there yesterday. Went to the Senate gym. I was there with Chuck Schumer and John Thune and others, and I miss the relationships. There are good people there, Democrats and Republicans, and that's why it's so maddening to see, what goes on social media and on the cable channels sometimes that make it look like we're all at each other's throats all the time. The Senate is a wonderful institution, as is the House. We have a good system where pendulums swing. If one party moves too far, that pendulum swings with a vengeance. My concern now is, for the institution, is that I'm not so much concerned about ideology, because pendulums do swing. I'm a conservative. I would like to have conservative leadership, but if it's progressive or liberal leadership and they go too far, the pendulum will swing. But when you change the political culture, I'm not sure that pendulum swings back, certainly not as fast. And that's really my concern now, is that this culture is changing, and the way media has developed in particular makes it very difficult for that shift to come back, for us to all be more civil to each other. And that's why it is really going to take strong leadership, first from the president, and I don't think it can be this president. The next president, whoever that is, has to be a strong leader, and the leadership in the House and the Senate needs to be different on both parties. So, but I miss relationships there, and I miss the institution. We have a good system there that usually corrects for the foibles of those of us who go through the institution.
One more question before we turn it to the audience. Share one more story with us. What was your best moment in Congress?
There are a lot of them, but the one that sticks out mostly is from the time I got to Congress in 2001, the House, I always thought, as a Republican, one policy just bothered me. It was our policy toward Cuba. I thought, as a Republican, we preach the gospel of commerce, of trade, of travel, as a way to nudge countries toward democracy. But with Cuba, let's isolate them. And I always thought, if you want to get rid of the Castro brothers, make them deal with spring break once or twice. Just. And so what really bothered me was the travel ban, economic embargoes or whatever, but the travel ban, not even letting people go down there. And so I was able in the early years to pass legislation to lift the travel ban. I couldn't get President Bush to sign it. Later on, President Obama was willing to sign that legislation, but by then I couldn't pass it through the Senate. But President Obama was able to reverse some previous executive orders and allow more Americans to travel, which was a good thing, and to increase the entrepreneurial class in Cuba, where they weren't as dependent on their communist government. That's a good thing. But that was happening, but not fast enough, because we couldn't change certain policies until the Cubans had released an American that they had imprisoned by the name of Alan Gross. Alan was a USAID contractor who was down in Cuba trying to give better information, thumb drives, whatever, to the Cuban people, and the Cubans caught him, charged him as a spy, convicted him, and put him in prison for 20 or some year sentence. And he'd been in prison about 5 years. We'd been working, myself and Patrick Leahy and others, to try to release him, along with we worked with his wife, and we just weren't making much progress. Tom Udall and I traveled down and saw him in prison in November of 14, and he was in a bad way. He was saying that he was ready to take his own life. He even looked up at the glass panel in the cell we were in and said, because Cuban government's always watching this kind of stuff, he said, "You hear that? I'm going to take myself out." And so I got home and went to the White House and said, "If you're not negotiating for his release, you better hurry." And they had been. They'd been working on it. A couple weeks later, I got a call from the White House saying, "Will you undertake a sensitive mission? You can't tell your wife or your staff where you're going." And I had a sense of what it was, and so Pat Leahy and I went to Andrews Air Force Base on that Wednesday, the 17th of December, 2014, and got on one of the president's planes along with Judy Gross and went down to Cuba to do an old Cold War era prisoner or spy swap. And a plane took off right after us to pick up a Cuban national who had spied for us, who had been in prison for 20 years. We were to pick up Alan Gross. Another plane took off from Miami with 3 Cubans who had been in our prisons. We all landed at separate airfields, and we went in, Pat and I and Chris Van Hollen, and got Alan and reunited him with his wife, and it was just a wonderful scene. And we went out to the tarmac, and exactly 31 minutes after we landed, we got the signal. All 3 planes had to take off at the same time. And we got in the air, and about 30 minutes in the air, I'll never forget, and this is the moment, the pilot came on and said, "We've now entered U.S. airspace." And Alan Gross stood up and just put his hands in the air and cheered, and then just breathed in and out several times and just said, "Now I know I'm free." And that was the moment. That was the best moment. And it
Thank you
speaks
for
to
that
what
wonderful story.
speaks to what a wonderful country this is. No matter what challenges or problems we have, this is the best country in the world.
Amen to that. Okay, and with that, we'll open it up to audience questions. Oren? What? Wait.
A more
We
recent
all know each other now.
definition of conservative has to do with social conservatism.
Is that on?
Is it on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
A more recent, definition of conservative is social conservatism. And one group we have tiptoed around or have been in denial about on the liberal side are the 85 million evangelicals in this country, which many believe hold the key to Trump's re-election or non-re-election, depending on how many will sit on their hands out of disgust for him. And yet evangelicals as a group are villainized by many on the liberal or social liberal side. Can you give me your thoughts on the evangelical movement and what they might do in the next election?
I believe the president believes that, that's his key, and he certainly tried to, in every way he can, express fidelity with the evangelical movement. There are variations within the faith community, if you want to put it that way, but that is a base that is very excited about what he has promised and what they feel he has delivered. But that's not enough, in my view. It's not enough, and I just think that the autopsy that we did in 2012 as a party that said to win elections, far into the future, we've got to appeal to a broader electorate. It was not just with minorities or Hispanics. It was with suburban women. It was to others. We've just got to broaden our appeal. So I don't think that that's going to be enough. If you look at the midterms as a proxy, there were 9 million more votes cast nationwide for Democratic candidates for Congress than for Republicans. That's significant. And so I know that the president believes that that's going to be enough. I don't think that it is.
Gentleman over here in front.
Thank you. Thanks for your work. Truly an inspiration. I was brought to wipe a tear during 2 points tonight, the Gabby Gifford story where you stood her up, and of course, the flight home. I want you to drill down a little bit deeper into something you said earlier on in the conversation for everybody in the room and underscore the importance of something that you did before you left office. The first bipartisan climate bill in a decade was introduced in the House, the Energy Innovation Act. 3 weeks later, you and Chris Coons introduced a companion bill. It was the first time in the history of our country that we had support for a plan, a bipartisan and bicameral support, first time in the country. So thank you for that. And I would ask you, if you would please, to explain to people in this room why they should support, why conservatives in this room should support a plan like the Energy Innovation Act, which was reintroduced in the new Congress.
Well, as I mentioned, where I come from as a conservative, as somebody who believes in free markets, that's at scale. If you're going to, do what you really need to do, I guess you put as another option would be the cap and trade alternative, which was far too complicated, far too easy for politicians to pick winners and losers and industries that they favor or don't favor. With a carbon tax, it's imposed. And you mitigate it in certain ways. You certainly mitigate it in ways where you make it revenue neutral, whether that's a payroll tax deduction, as we did in the House bill years ago, or by another means. But you make it so consumers or individuals are made whole, and also individual states and industries can deal with it in different ways. But it's really the only way, I believe, that you can, at scale, attack the problem. And as conservatives, we've got to get there somewhere. One, politically, if you want to put the substance aside, millennials and others are leaving us, and they believe in the science, as I do, that mankind is a major player here, and we need to deal with it. So, if they don't believe the substance, I hope my colleagues will fix on the politics of it and say we've got to move forward on this.
Let's see. Yes. Go ahead.
When you were in the Senate, you spoke your conscience twice, as I recall, maybe more. You alluded to the fact that your other colleagues stood back. They didn't talk up. Is this because they really believe in some of these conservative principles that have been altered by the White House? Or do you think it's just because they want to keep their jobs?
I don't want to impugn my colleagues. I can just tell you, for me, I told you why I couldn't run for re-election again. But I do think that there are some in the Republican caucus who are more comfortable with some of the president's populist on trade protectionist provisions, for example, that have been kind of anathema to conservatives for a while. But there are different strains in the party on that. So some are warming to the president's policies there, but a lot of it obviously is concern about re-election. Right now it is extremely difficult to oppose the president and win in a Republican primary. You have to remember that those who vote in Republican primaries are a subset of a subset of a subset, and they're motivated and they get out there. And right now, the polls that show that some 80 to 90% of the motivated party regulars who vote in primaries are with the president. Those polls are pretty accurate. And so it's very difficult. The latest example, Justin Amash, realizing Justin is more classically conservative, classical liberal, a more libertarian-leaning conservative, but he felt comfortable in the party, not so much now, but having opposed the president, that in a Republican primary is really a death knell, and a lot of my colleagues obviously recognize that.
So I'd love to give the last question to one of my sisters in the audience. Okay.
Thank you for coming this evening. I'm curious what your future holds.
We have another question.
That's a good last question.
Somebody take my wife out of the room first. No, I've been doing politics for the last 18 years, and that's a while. And right now I find it difficult. I'm not sure where there is for a Republican like me in a party like this. So it makes it difficult in traditional Republican politics. I do think, I'm not suggesting, I don't think we're going to have an independent candidate for president who's going to win, or in most states, but I do think those traditions can change more quickly state by state. Some states like Maine, Vermont have a tradition of electing independent senators. I think that one of the things that you'll see first is more states, if the parties continue in the way that they are, particularly my party, the Republican Party, I do think that it'll be easier for independent, registered independent, not a new party, but independents to be elected in Senate races and some House races nationwide. That would be cathartic, I believe. I think it would be a good development. If you could just have a few independent senators who could caucus with either party at any time and create a new power center in the Senate, that would be helpful at this stage of the game. I'd like to see that develop. I don't know how quickly it can. I don't think I'm out of politics forever, but I do think the fever needs to cool a bit, and I hope it does. And Cheryl and I have really enjoyed this chapter of our lives, the 6 months that I've been out so far. Cheryl will remind me there have been no death threats in what now, almost five months. But then I'm reminded, do a Google search just yesterday, and there's somebody still being sentenced in Chicago for a threat that he made on our family back in the fall. So those things, and that's the difficulty here right now. I mentioned that the incentives are just to run to your tribe, state where you are. Don't indicate for a moment that you might be open to persuasion, that a hearing that is being conducted might inform your vote, that an investigation going on might be dispositive somehow. As soon as you admit that, then you're a target of everybody. And I can tell you from experience, that's not a comfortable place to be in. And that's why you see such a polarized environment now, because people will make a calculation, elected officials, I only want to anger one side, and I won't really even anger that side because they will never think I was gettable. And so that's why you have the polarization that you have today, and I'd like to play a role however I can in ending that. We're doing this Common Ground series with CBS, where Common Ground is scarce in Washington, but it's alive and well everywhere else at the local level. And so we're telling those stories and doing a number of other things, teaching and speaking, but we'll see. I don't exactly know at this point.
Well, if you ever want an open and civil discussion, come back and visit us again in Aspen.
This is the place for it.
Senator Flake.